Good afternoon and welcome to the Pacific Salmon Commission Seminar Series on Environmental Variation and Pacific Salmon Management, the view from both sides of the border. My name is John Holmes and I'm the Canadian co-chair of the Coho Technical Committee, and I'm pleased to introduce the second seminar in our series titled New Salmon Habitat, From Glacial Retreat to Spawning in the Arctic, featuring Dr. Jonathan Moore from the Salmon Watersheds Lab at Simon Fraser University, Dr. Karen Dunmall, who's an Arctic biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and special guests Jody, Illasiak, and Michelle Gruben. The two presentations that you're going to see today provide pretty fascinating observations on how Pacific salmon are responding to their environment, and they provide equally fascinating perspectives on acquiring and mobilizing knowledge to inform future resource management approaches and decisions. So before we go any further, let me introduce our speakers, I should say. Jonathan Moore is a professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia and holds the Lieber Eero Research Chair of Coastal Science and Management. He received his PhD from the University of Washington and has researched salmon in their watersheds from Alaska to California to British Columbia. He studies freshwater biodiversity, watersheds, and global change, with particular focus on BC's rivers and their salmon, and he's published over 100 papers on these topics. He works closely with a diverse array of collaborators and partner organizations to co-develop research and communicate their findings so that they contribute to positive watershed change. He lives in North Vancouver, British Columbia, and loves exploring coastal oceans, mountains, forests, and rivers with his family. Dr. Karen Dunmall is a research scientist for the Arctic region of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Her research program focuses on monitoring biodiversity change of fishes and assessing coastal ecosystems across the Canadian Arctic by bringing people and their knowledge together. She lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba, so way over by Hudson Bay. Jody Illasiak, I should say, is a subsistence hunter and fisherman from Pawtucket, Northwest Territories. He is the decision maker at the co-management level through the Pawtucket Hunter and Trapper Committee, the Nunavut Game Council, and is the chair of the I did practice this.
Angunakvian Marine Protected Area.
Thank you, Jody. Michelle Gruben is a subsistence officer from Aklavik, which is in the Mackenzie River watershed, Northwest Territories. She's a key person supporting the co-management process in her role as the resource person for the Aklavik Hunters and Trappers Committee. So the plan for today is to hear about glacial retreat from John, followed by Pacific salmon expansion in the Arctic from Karen, Jody, and Michelle. After the presentations have concluded, there will be a short break followed by a moderated question and answer session. Please use the question and answer feature in Teams to pose your questions to the speakers at any time throughout their talks. If you don't have a question, then you can upvote the questions that are posed. The moderators will choose the highest voted questions to pose to our speakers. If there are more questions than can be answered than the time available, we'll endeavor to get written responses from our speakers and include those responses in the seminar package. Thanks. And just before I say I'm now on with the presentations, let me put in a plug for our next seminar on May 25th, which will be on Indigenous knowledge and salmon management. So mark that on your calendars and register for it when we put out the call for registration. And so now on with the presentations. Over to you, John.
Great, thank you. Can folks see my screen okay? All right, thank you. Well, thanks for putting this on and inviting me. I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation today with Michelle, Jody, and Karen. And we got a chance to chat ahead of time, and I think there's going to be some really interesting cross-cutting themes that emerge. And I thought we could just highlight those off the bat, and we can, those will play out over these two conversations. First, it seems like salmon systems, the complex systems that salmon call home, are changing really rapidly. And they're being changed by these sort of dual drivers, these linked drivers, but dual drivers of human-caused climate change and then also anthropogenic land use. And then secondly, these changes are really playing out in complex ways in these really connected and big and complicated ecosystems. And these systems consist not just of the rivers and their salmon, but also people. And it's, I think, really key to think about the cultural fabric that is woven through these systems and how we collectively are responding to these rapid changes. And so it'll be really great to learn from the conversations today. And so today what I'm going to be doing is talking about some of the work that mostly my group has been doing, thinking about glacial retreat and thinking about the opportunities as well as challenges that this might pose for salmon in some of these rapidly changing watersheds. And as mentioned, I'm a professor at Simon Fraser University on the outskirts of Vancouver, British Columbia, and I'm calling in from Deep Cove in North Vancouver, which is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. So I just want to start by actually rewinding the clock about 18,000 years to the last glacial maximum. And so 18,000 years ago, this coastline, the salmon coast, looked very, very different. And so ice sheet covered much of the current range of salmon with some coastal refugia, and then also northern and southern places that weren't covered by the ice sheets. And it was just a really different, it's hard to frankly understand how different this was. 18,000 years ago is not that long ago, actually, from sort of a salmon perspective. Salmon evolved millions and millions of years ago, but they persisted through these times of a massive change. And so back then, the world was about 10 degrees colder, we estimate, and sea level was over 100 meters lower because so much water was locked up as ice. And so over this times of change, salmon evolved, and one can imagine that the different impacts that glaciers and all these other climate change processes have really shaped the life histories that we see today and the resilience that salmon express. And so if we look forward to today, what's left of the glaciers is a small remnant of their historical coverage of this ecosystem. But of course, the landscapes that salmon inhabit, many of them have been shaped by glaciers. And so if we look at, big U-shaped valleys that were carved out by this immense force of ice, leaving behind massive amounts of sediment that rivers then carve their ways through and floodplains develop, that sort of the legacy of glaciers is still being seen today, even if those glaciers have been gone for a long time. And across the salmon landscape, different regions have different amounts of glacial coverage. And, based on some of the analysis that my team have done, of these different watersheds or regions, 85% of them have at least some amount of glaciers that will have different impacts on these systems. And based on the current data, there's about 46,000 glaciers that exist within this landscape. So this map shows the coverage of glaciers and their prevalence across these different regions and subwatersheds, with deeper blue colors indicating regions that have greater glacial coverage. So some places have no glaciers, some places have small percentages of glaciers where they're on the peaks only, these little ice cubes on top of the mountains, whereas some places still have more than 20% of the entire region is covered under ice. And there's striking imagery emerging now about how contemporary and human-caused climate change is accelerating the pace of this glacial loss. And so over the span of decades, we can look at repeat imagery and we can see how climate change is transforming these ecosystems, how what used to be under hundreds and hundreds of meters of ice that's thousands of years old, is now a lake or a river. It's a newborn ecosystem unlocked from under the ice. And projections, depending on the climate scenario, estimate that many of the glaciers will be gone by the end of the century. And so one paper estimated that 80% of glaciers will be gone in Western Canada by 2100 under a moderate emissions scenario. And this, of course, this is such a striking symptom and symbol of climate change. And I think it, speaks to the urgency of addressing global emissions of greenhouse gases, but it also, is playing out in complicated ways. And so by understanding how these ecosystems are changing rapidly, that information, I think, can guide proactive management of these rapidly changing systems. So today what I wanted to do is just talk through some of the pathways by which we think contemporary glacial retreat is impacting salmon systems. How is the sort of rapid retreat of ice altering salmon and their habitats? To address this, a couple years ago, we brought together a group of experts for a working group. And it was a great group of folks, and we brought together people that had, the expertise in glaciers, expertise in climate change and watershed science, as well as salmon nerds like myself. And we tried to synthesize what's known about the impacts of glaciers across the different stages of their retreat. And so I'm going to present some of those ideas here. And this project was led by Dr. Kara Pittman, who is a PhD student in my group. So what we did is we sort of really just simplified this story and thought about the different stages of glacier retreat. And if we look at the schemata, what we can imagine is that some systems are mostly covered with ice, and they might have a small river below, and that river is probably going to be really complicated and braiding just because of the high amounts of sediment that's being loaded into the system. Very dynamic floodplain. As a glacier retreats, it's going to leave behind new habitats. Maybe it will create a lake through the creation of that moraine where it pushed sediments that are then holding back a lake. And that'll have a different, downstream ecosystem. And then as that glacier marches up the mountain, that river will lengthen, the downstream habitats will develop and continue to adapt. The vegetation will become more pronounced in the floodplain. That floodplain will probably become more stable, and it'll be colonized by species such as salmon. And then one can imagine a future without glaciers in some of these systems. And so this is, of course, unfolding at different paces and at different places. And so, in some places, there's going to be this complex mosaic within a given big watershed of some systems that are, heavily glaciated, and some have no glaciers, and all these sort of processes are unfolding across these dynamic landscapes. So what actually happens across these stages? Based on synthesizing what's known, we can make some predictions about how some of those key master variables are changing. And this all sort of makes sense, but I think it's important to think about. What we have here is some schemata, some stylized graphs of water flow through the year, and then water temperatures. So in a system with lots of glaciers, that water is going to be cold year round, maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius year round. And then the meltwater is going to happen, during the summer. It's going to be low flows during much of the year, but then when that glacier starts to melt in July or August, that's when highest flows might be. As that glacier retreats more, there's going to be peak water. There's going to be the highest discharges across this whole stage during this phase of sort of intermediate glacial retreat. Again, peak water during the summer, and water temperatures might warm up a bit. And then this proceeds as the glacier melts, the water continues to warm, and the flow regime shifts such that no longer is there that midsummer or late summer glacial melt period that's driving that flow regime. And this is playing out in terms of what we see about how climate is changing these ecosystems and impacting these ecosystems. So this is a really hard-hitting paper that was published by some scientists out of Alaska primarily. And what they did is they synthesized what was known about a big drought and heat wave that hit Alaska in 2019. And shown here is a picture from that summer where you have this small coastal stream just filled with pink salmon that died on their way up to spawn because that stream went dry. And what they did is they plotted out which systems had events like this, had this pre-spawn mortality, and which ones didn't. And what they found is that if systems have about 5% glacial coverage or so, then they're much less likely to have these pre-spawn mortality events. And so glaciers, the importance of glaciers in providing these cool summer water is quite important, especially during some of these heat wave events. There's other processes that are going to unfold as streams and there's ecosystems adapt and evolve as glaciers retreat. For example, turbidity we predict to generally go down, and then also the food web basis, the invertebrate prey that might be the food for stream marine salmon like coho, you might think would increase their abundance and productivity as well. Of course, these types of patterns will have a lot of context dependency. They'll unfold at different rates and in different places. And some of the key factors that we think that might be really modulating the ways that glacial retreat will unfold are things like the regional climate. One can imagine that, if a location only gets, 20 centimeters of rain, like in dry interior watershed, the loss of that, glacial meltwater might be quite pronounced during the summer, whereas an equivalently sized watershed in a place that gets, not 20 centimeters of rain a year, but 2 meters of rain a year, like some of the coastal rainforest systems, that's going to be a different story. Similarly, watershed size, lakes, and river valley forms will also be key modulators of these patterns, we think. And I feel really lucky to be working on this on the ground as well a little bit. There's a pretty new collaboration that I feel fortunate to be working with the Taku River Tlingit and supporting their work, thinking about salmon resiliency in the Taku River of northern BC, and then it flows into southeast Alaska. And this is one of those watersheds that's really being transformed, really changing rapidly. And I thought I'd just share a picture to bring you to this place. This is a picture I took about 1.5 years ago, trying not to shake as I was holding that camera half in and out of the water with a grizzly pair poised above the Chinook salmon on her way up to spawn. And then she pounced and I got totally doused by water. And yeah, I guess that was a humbling event for sure. But regardless, this is, as I mentioned, one of these places that is really being transformed before our eyes with these symptoms of climate change. And so even just like 15 years ago, collaborator took a pictures, and if we look at what that looks like now, there's a brand new lake, lake that's several kilometers long that used to be under the ice. And getting out of the water and getting a chance to study these systems, it's pretty amazing to think that, just 2 decades ago, this used to be under 10,000, 20,000 year old ice. And this is sort of future habitat that's being formed that might be for salmon. And so what we've been talking about so far has mostly been that there will be this sort of all these different downstream effects of glacier retreat. But as these glaciers march up these river valleys, if those rivers aren't too steep for salmon, then salmon, will probably find these habitats. It represents new habitat for salmon. And work by Sandy Milner's team and many others have described this repeatedly. And so, for example, in some of their classic work, they've monitored some of these brand new streams that were only created, for example, in 1970 or so, and they're counting 10,000 or more pink salmon in them, in a couple decades after these streams were born. And so, Kara Pittman, again, that PhD student in my group who did this work, she was interested in trying to understand, where and when might this happen. If we look across those 46,000 glaciers and we apply, climate change scenarios to them, and then also, look at simple models of what types of habitat salmon can access, where and when will glacial retreat create new habitat? And so that's what she did in a massive spatial analyst type of approach. I don't know how she does this kind of stuff, but it's pretty amazing. She did this. She estimated where and when new habitat will be created across the range of salmon and glaciers. And those data are shown here. This was published last year in Nature Communications. And what she found is that, not surprisingly, there's much of the range where the glaciers are already so high that their retreat will only have downstream effects. It will only, represent lost water flows, and it won't create new habitat towards the southern range of salmon in particular. But then up in parts of transboundary region and then up through central and south central Alaska, there are some regions where actually predicting substantial increases in the amount of river kilometers that are available to be colonized by salmon. And so we predict that there will be, under a moderate climate change emissions scenario, over 6,000 kilometers of new habitat. And 6,000 kilometers, it's hard to sort of put one's finger on what that means. That's roughly twice the length of the Yukon River. And so it's a lot of new habitat that will be created in some of these local regions. But it's not just salmon that are looking to these glacial edges for new habitat. People are as well. And so mining companies are looking to glacial retreat for new mineral deposits that haven't seen the light of day since the last glacial maximum. And so here's a quote: "In 8 years of glacial retreat, at the rate it's been going, there could be an ore body sticking right out of the ground that nobody's ever been seen before." And this is coming from the sort of transboundary region. And in different parts, different mines are different, but mines do have a history of potentially causing real serious environmental harm that can be quite long lasting. And, there is a bit of a modern day gold rush in some of these places where there is rapid glacial retreat, and the edges of this habitat, this sort of future salmon habitat, is one of these frontiers for mining. And so, just to quickly summarize, I think some of the key themes of what we're interested in, one is that, one is that glacial retreat will have a suite of downstream impacts, and those will play out in complicated ways, and those might pose, real challenges to salmon in some areas through losses of summer flows or further increasing water temperatures to places where it can cause harm to salmon. In other locations, there will be local opportunities for salmon as glaciers march up river valleys and as salmon find them. It presents local opportunities. But of course, salmon systems also consist of people, and people are also looking to those nascent newborn ecosystems for opportunities. And I think there's really important decisions that need to get made about, well, given we know how these systems are changing, given we know their future salmon habitat, how are we stewarding into the future? And I think this is a broad question that's of urgent importance, whether we're thinking about glacial retreat or other climate change symptoms that are rolling out rapidly and transforming these systems. Snowmelt is rapidly decreasing. There's all these different pathways. Sea level is rising. I think there's a real urgent need for proactive science to try to understand how these systems are changing, but then also proactive management options, management activities to really steward these systems into this uncertain future. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Karen, it's over to you. You, Jody, and Michelle.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks, John, that was a really interesting talk. I enjoyed learning a lot about salmon as they seek new habitat where glaciers are melting. So thanks everybody for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Karen Dunmall. I'm a research scientist at Fisheries and Oceans Canada in Winnipeg, which is not quite over by Hudson Bay. I guess it's a little bit south. I study fish biodiversity change and coastal ecosystems across the Canadian Arctic by bringing knowledge together and using community-led approaches. I'm here today with Jody Illasiak and Michelle Gruben, and together we'll tell you some perspectives on Pacific salmon expanding across the Canadian Arctic. And Jody and Michelle will have a chance to introduce themselves in a moment. But first, I want to remind everybody that this is a collaborative project. We are the three that are privileged to talk to you about it today, but we are only a fraction of the number of people and organizations that are involved in monitoring salmon expanding across the Canadian Arctic. Everybody brings a piece of the story, and together we can try and help understand the changes that are occurring. For a little orientation, this is our study area. It's the whole Canadian Arctic. I'm at the Orange Star in Winnipeg, and I acknowledge I'm on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Michelle is in Aklavik, Northwest Territories at the Silver Star, and Jody is in Paulatuk at the Yellow Star. And I'll give Michelle a chance to introduce herself, please.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Gruben. I live in Aklavik, the white star on the map, and I am the resource person, office manager for the Aklavik Hunters and Trappers Committee, and we do a lot of collaboration with DFO, and Karen is one of the co people I work with. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And Jody, can you please introduce yourself?
Thanks, Karen, Michelle. Good day, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for allowing us to present on our concerns and findings on the salmon's issues / concerns in our area. So my name is Jody Illasiak. I'm from Paulatuk, Northwest Territories. I sit on the Paulatuk Hunters and Trappers Committee as a director. And through the HTC seat I hold, I've been appointed the ANMPA working group member, and I chair that working group. I also sit on Inuvialuit Game Council for our region, our regional body. Under that belt, I hold the Grizzly Bear working group. I'm a member on there, and I also hold the shipping file for the Inuvialuit Game Council. So thank you.
Thanks, Jody. So both Jody and Michelle are going to explain the history of salmon in each of their communities, and you'll hear a very different story for each community. Jody will start. Go ahead, Jody.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, the history has been, almost as old as I am, and probably goes even further back where stories weren't told from our elders and so on. So the history of salmon, the first I've heard of a harvester catching a salmon was about 30 or so years ago. His name is John Max Kudluck, a well-known subsistence harvester in our community. So he caught one up in our Hornaday River system, which is a prime area for our Arctic char. And the area he caught it in is called Ucluck Creek. And anyways, after a few years of catching it, 2016, 17, 18, 19, started discussing about salmon. And in 2019, great influx happened where numbers exploded in our area. I mean, we're getting salmon in our our main Char River system. We're getting salmon in our lakes where we get our lake trout, our lake whitefish, losh, landlocked char, and so on. They were getting into lakes and creeks 30 kilometers inland. That was probably a day after the main big catch, I guess you'd call it. So they weren't only along the coast, but they were 30 plus kilometers inland in these dry creeks that we considered that should have no fishing, or there are numbers. Anyways, the concern is major for the sake of our key species, the char, and escalated to get them out of here. It gotten to that point along the way. We, Karen, myself, and a few other technicians today, his name is Stacy Wilkie, is working closely with Karen Dunmall. We installed water and air temperature loggers in our Hornaday River system, which Karen will expand on. We are nearing the time frame where they are expected to come back from their ocean run. So thank you.
Thanks, Jody. Yeah, so in Paulatuk, about 30 years ago was the first reported salmon, and then not so many, and then all of a sudden a lot in 2019. And Michelle, is now going to talk about the history of salmon in Aklavik.
For the Aklavik community of Aklavik, where I live, we live here in the Mackenzie Delta. We have heard of salmon being collected in the community for years. Like it's almost like a old story you hear from the elders in the community. People used to call them dog salmon, feed them to their dogs. But the elders who tell us that story, you know, they're quite old, there must be 80. So if they're telling us those stories of salmon years and years ago, they had to be here in the system years ago. Working at the Aklavik HTC, I've been here since 2009. We have taken a lot of salmon from local harvesters who either catch salmon here in the river system or out in the Arctic Ocean. We also do fall tagging of Dolly, Varden, Char, where Jody is, he's in Polituck and I'm in Aklavik. So we get different char than them. But the char we get when we go up to the fish holes in our area, we're starting to notice, like in September of last year, we noticed a salmon in one of the fish holes. So the community members are asking questions like, will they take over the char fishing spots, or will they override the salmon char? You know, there's still a lot of questions we want to ask, but talking to elders in the community, salmon has been around this area for a few years, or I shouldn't even say a few years, like for a long time. So if elders are telling us, that's the history from here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. So there's been salmon in Aklavik for a long time, which is a different story than in Polituck. You heard Michelle mention the collection of salmon. She's referring to what we call the Arctic Salmon Project, which is a community-based project that monitors biodiversity change of fish, not just salmon, but there's lots of fish changing across the north, and subsistence harvests across the Canadian Arctic. So people are catching strange things in their nets, and they're wondering, what are these fish? They may recognize them as something different, but may not know exactly what they are. Where are they coming from, and what do they mean for the fish that we normally catch? For Arctic salmon, it's been in operation since the year 2000, and so now over 20 years of tracking and monitoring salmon appearing across the Canadian Arctic. I'll show you that trend in a series of dots, and each color represents a different species. And with the progression of the dots, you'll see how the number of communities that are reporting salmon is increasing, and then the different species that are around are also increasing. So chum salmon will be the white dots, and you heard Michelle here talk of a historic harvest of chum salmon on the Mackenzie River, which is represented by that. And then also chum salmon are being harvested in places where they have never been harvested before, and you heard Jody talk about that in Polituck, for example. Pink salmon are represented by yellow dots. The first pink salmon that were received in the Arctic Salmon Program, that's not necessarily the first pink salmon that was harvested in the Canadian Arctic, but it's the first one we have in the database, was in 2004. And then since then, they've been expanding across the Canadian Arctic and being harvested in places that have never harvested pink salmon before. And then sockeye salmon is the third most common Pacific salmon species. There's really not a history of sockeye salmon harvest at all. And then most recently, in the last 5 years, sockeye salmon are being harvested mostly in the outer communities in the Beaufort Sea region. So there's lots of changes going on, and those are being monitored and tracked with the help of the communities and harvesters across the Canadian Arctic. This is the graph that represents what I just spoke of and what you heard from Michelle and Jody. There is a low-level history of harvest of chum salmon, which is the black line. Every once in a while, there's years where there's lots of salmon present, and the most exceptional one was in 2019, where there was a lot of salmon in the rivers, is mostly in the Western Canadian Arctic. The different colors represent different species, and you can see most recently more species are appearing. So the exceptional years are getting really high numbers of salmon, and there's a lot of variability, and the number of species that are showing up is increasing. So with all of those changes, we get a lot of questions from people who are harvesting the salmon. And Jody and Michelle will talk about some of those questions from their perspectives in Polytech and Aklavik. And Jody will go first.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, this unexpected situation in my community was a major concern, with a bunch of community questions posed to Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Fisheries Joint Management Committee over a few meetings. And the main question overall and overarching is still not fully understood or fully answered is, will the salmon compete with our char in their habitat? Not only their char habitat, but the char's food sources. And that came about through my seat I hold on Innivalid Game Council. You hear concerns from around our region, and to hear information that they are starting to fish in different areas, other than the normal areas they fish in for the lake whitefish, also the herring, lake trout, which means there's more effort. They're using more gas. They're buying more grub, and etc. And info from research is the salmon are aggressive. They're territorial, and also there was a juvenile that's proof that you can't deny or push aside. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Jody. Yeah, there's lots of concern about the salmon competing with the char, and Michelle will also talk about that from the perspective of Aklavik.
Yeah, for our community members in Aklavik, when we do accept salmon from the local harvesters, when they do catch salmon, because the salmon has a salmon reward program, it's good for the harvesters that way because they're getting like a gift card in replace of the salmon. But they have questions like, will that salmon, make other fishes, other animals or other fish not go into their net? Or how will it compete with the other animals, other fish that we catch? Because there could be predators at the fish holes. It could be affecting the char that we get. So there's a lot of questions that are still to be answered. And I really do appreciate the members coming and telling us the information that they want to get asked, because our HTC, we're here to provide information for them. And thanks to Karen for the information.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, one of the other questions that we get is, will salmon eat the same things as char and our other freshwater fishes? So we've looked at that from the perspective of stomach contents and stable isotopes to better understand if salmon are eating the same things as other fishes in the marine environment, and also up the Mackenzie River system. It's a long river. And from listening to harvesters, the fish, some of the salmon are actually eating in the freshwater. So we're trying to understand what they're eating and if it's the same thing as
and
other.
I could also add that, Jody touched a little bit about the water, the water loggers. And through there too, we notice that the water is warming up a little bit. We could see that little bit of a trend. So that's something too we collaborate with DFO on.
Excellent, thanks, Michelle. So there's a few themes that have run through our talk. One is Indigenous knowledge is key to understanding salmon change and changing ecosystems. You heard Michelle and Jody provide their knowledge and that of their communities. And that is really vital in understanding this changes that are going on. The other theme that we'd like you to hear is that working together, everyone can contribute a piece of the story so that together we can tell the bigger picture. Jody mentioned one example of that, which is that juvenile chum salmon that was actually caught in a field program that was run by US Geological Survey. It's the first juvenile chum that was confirmed to species using genetic techniques. And it confirms that the successful reproduction and nearshore marine survival is possible for Pacific salmon in the North American Arctic. And another example.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, go ahead, Jody.
Sorry, I'd also like to mention and make note that research is also key to coming out with answers for our very heavy questions. So just before we move on.
Excellent, thanks, Jody. Yeah, and then the other paper there is one by Darcy McNichol. And again, it's a group of scientists and people in communities working together to report and track rare or new occurrences of fish across the Canadian Arctic. So I really appreciate Jody mentioning that the research is an important piece of working together, understanding these changes. So there are some take-home messages we'd like you to have from our talk. And Jody, can you speak to the first couple?
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, as Karen mentioned on the numbers, as you can see, first had the salmon numbers are increasing in the Canadian Arctic. We know that for a fact, and this increase in numbers of salmon are a major concern in our area, and not only for our chars, but for many other species of fish as subsistence harvesters rely on as our food source. And char is about 50% of our diet here in Paulituck. And mind you, if we could have char for every meal, that's what we'd have every day. And these other species of fish are a major part of our diet as well. I say that because there's evidence through harvesting that habitats are changing due to the presence of salmon. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Jody. And then Michelle, what are some take-home messages you'd like us to have?
Along with this, on these bullets, salmon is only one example of change. We do have other changes along, because we are in the river system, like the rivers are getting wider, climate change is affecting everything. And being harvesters up here in where we live in the Illasiak settlement region, climate change is affecting our everyday lives. Like long ago, we used to be able to read the weather. Now today, the weather could change within an hour. So you really have to plan your travel properly. Climate change is affecting not only the things we eat from the land, but the way we travel the land. So, but we have to adapt. We have to learn to adapt in, like right away, not learn about it, but if we're on the land, we gotta learn to live with it and make our changes to our livelihood because of climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And that's it from us. Again, we'd like to acknowledge there's many people and organizations involved in tracking salmon across the Canadian Arctic, and some of them are listed here. And we're happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Jody, and thank you, Michelle. So we're actually, while people are going to get their thoughts collected and ask questions in the Q&A, we're just going to take a few minutes for a break, for stretching, and we're going to resume in about 5 minutes. So it's 2:46. We'll come back at 2:50 for the Q&A, and we'll ask all the questions. So we ask all the audience, if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. So we'll be right back. All right, well, welcome back, everybody, for the extended question and answer period. And thank you to everyone who's submitted a question in the chat box. We're going to try to get to all the questions, and if we don't get to all of them, then our speakers will do their best to provide a written answer and follow up. So our first question is from Mickey Uga, and it's for Dr. Jonathan Moore. Excellent talk, Jonathan. Have you explored the potential effects of sea level rise and how that might interact with the effects of glacial retreat? I would suspect we might be looking at habitat squeeze in some coastal areas rather than expansion.
Yeah, thanks for that. And really interesting question. I think the point's really well made that, you know, these different climate change symptoms are not happening in isolation, and there can be really important sort of interactions. I think the sea level rise one is a very interesting one, actually, because in places where there's a lot of glaciers, the glacial retreat actually is causing isostatic rebound, so the earth is rising up. And so the sort of relative sea level might actually be going down compared to most places. And so just that weight of the earth, weight of the ice is decreasing. So the land's rising. So people in like Gustavus, Alaska, for example, now have a kilometer of new waterfront because, you know, the sea level is actually going out. But I think in general, I think the point's really well made about sea level rise and glacial retreat acting in concert. We do have a big project on sea level rise and resilience of estuary systems, but it's not really in habitat that overlaps with glaciers too much. But I think it's going to play out in complicated ways across space.
Great. We have a question for Karen and Michelle, and that is, have you been looking, it comes from Gary Morishima. It says, are you looking at parasites or diseases with these range expansions as you're seeing more and more salmon? What kind of monitoring is happening for the salmon you're finding?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Michelle, did you want to go ahead?
Working here at the Aklavik HTC, like Karen, is just one part of the puzzle at the DFO bubble. But we do work with other researchers at Department of Fisheries and Oceans for parasites on other fish that we do harvest from the ocean, such as what is herring called? I don't know.
Arctic Cisco.
Arctic Cisco. So we do have, and then we have researchers checking on parasites with Arctic Cisco, and we also have a Arctic ecosystem monitoring program where we take fish from where we harvest at Shingle Point, Dapkak, and they do a project, and we're just one piece of the puzzle, but there's other areas along the Beaufort Delta that do the similar programs with DFO.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Michelle. And then for salmon's contribution to that question, we work with most of the communities to sample salmon right in the community, including in Aklavik. And some of the samples that we take are to assess for parasites. And we just started up a project actually in April this month, 2022, that'll last for the next 3 years and try and understand whether salmon coming into the Arctic are vectors or carriers for viruses or pathogens to the Arctic. So we're starting to collect those samples, and the analysis will happen in the next couple of years. So excellent question. Thank you.
All right, our next question is back to Jonathan, and it comes from John Field. And he says Jonathan mentioned proactive management to address salmon habitat changes in coming years. So Jonathan, to put you on the spot, what does this look like? And maybe we'll want to also ask our other speakers as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I would love to hear what the other speakers have to say about this. I think the idea is that, you know, these systems are changing really fast, and I think we're so used to, you know, trying to conserve to the past. We're trying to sort of preserve to the way that the world's been, but the world is changing really fast. And so I think that's all still a vague answer. So I'll get a little bit more specific. And I think, you know, this proactive protection or proactive management really thinks about not just current salmon habitat, but future salmon habitat. And so, for example, should we be thinking about restricting mine claims on in systems that are forecasted to be important salmon habitat. Environmental decision making might look at those systems now and say, hey, there's no salmon here, we should do whatever we want. That's an exaggeration, but I think there's still this sort of usually backward looking and sort of present day approach to decision making, and I think it can be changed given what we're learning to look to the future. And I think the sea level rise is a great example too, where with sea levels, estuaries need to adapt. They need to march up those coastlines. And so, thinking about preserving the future of those estuaries is important. So I think that's the most obvious answer. But I think in terms of watershed management for salmon, I think another really key thing that we should be thinking about is the reality that many human impacts are having the same suite of effects on these systems as climate change. And so, for example, climate change is making river systems flashier, it's creating lower summer flows, and it's warming water temperatures. So those are some of the symptoms of climate change in much of BC, where I work and live. Those are the exact same things that logging does. And so one might ask the question of, okay, climate change is pushing these systems. Should we be thinking about timber management so that we avoid pushing these systems even further in some places to the place where salmon, are exhibiting pre-spawn mortality because water temperatures are getting too hot? So I think, again, it's just sort of, applying what we're learning about how these systems are changing, and then really translating it into on-the-ground decision-making in terms of land use and habitat use, and maybe even fisheries management, but I'm not going to get into that.
I would say from the perspective of the Arctic, this is potentially the future for salmon habitat, since there's very few that are spawning successfully right now. So that's basically what we're doing, is trying to assess if the salmon habitat is there, and also at the same time trying to understand the current conditions for Arctic species and where the interactions may occur. And that's what Michelle was referring to when she spoke of salmon showing up in the fish holes, which are the spawning places for Dolly Varden char or Arctic char in the case of Jody and Polytech. In both places and other places across the Arctic, we're trying to understand what is creating new salmon habitat. Is it because the seasons are getting longer, that in the spring sea ice is melting earlier, creating new opportunity? The salmon can show up to the Arctic earlier, access places earlier, potentially spawn earlier in warmer temperatures, which is giving them a little boost so that they may be able to viably produce eggs that develop over the Arctic winters, which you can imagine are cold. And so there's lots of changes that are occurring. And so we're kind of at the front end of understanding what that means from the perspective of salmon habitat. Michelle, did you have anything to add?
I just wanted to add that, a lot of us sit at work behind the desk, and a lot of our harvesters, that's like, I could say I'm a part-time harvester, but the people that bring in the salmon, I always like to hear what they have to say. Like, was the water cold? Was the water warm? Was it clear water? Because it changes. It always changes. And it's those harvesters who are catching the salmon that give us a lot of good information. So I really I'm a fisherman myself, and I get excited when they come in because I want to know what kind of stuff did they see where they were. So I really enjoy working with the salmon program and just talking to the harvesters. But the amount of salmon we've seen since I started here, the numbers, they keep going up. But because of COVID, we didn't get any salmon last year, and the year before it was really quiet, which is amazing for a Clavik.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going back to Jonathan now. So another question from Gary Morishima. So glacier melt will affect more than the spatial availability of habitat. Have any projections been made regarding how the changes in temperature and flow patterns might affect food webs, abundance, productivity, and availability of different species and stocks of salmon. Under environmental change, the migratory range and timing will differentially affect salmon stocks. And it seems, you can look to systems where there already has been glacial retreat, for example.
Yeah, so I think just to clarify it first, I hope in my talk I didn't imply that it's just spatial availability. I think I did speak to the different pathways by which glacial retreat will play out, including changing temperature, including changing flow regimes, and including changing food webs. I don't think there have been large scale projections about sort of the food web side of things and abundance and productivity with glacial retreat. There has been some nice work by Nate Mantua for some regions on forecasting stream flow and water temperatures in some parts of the region, and work by Lisa Crozier, again doing sort of climate change forecast types of life cycle approaches. Those are some of the sort of cutting edge work, in my opinion, on that. In general, they don't really get into the sort of food web effects. I think those are complicated and it's going to play out in different ways in different times. We do have a couple relevant projects. One project is we have synthesized, as far as we can tell, all the long-term data on juvenile salmon out-migration timing. And so they are changing in different ways, and really lots of local manifestations of climate change. And it's, I think one of the things that's going to be interesting and challenging is that I think some of these things we're just not going to be able to predict. I think it's just too complicated, and it's just going to be, play out in different ways. And I think from my own personal perspective, I would suggest that, trying to come up with the best fine-tuned prediction might not be the best investment of science, just because there's so many different ways about the way these worlds are changing. They're transforming, and we don't have a surrogate for, the way that they will be, because it doesn't exist now. So I think, keeping some of the analyses fairly high level and looking at the sort of coarse habitat types is frankly the place where I'm most comfortable, rather than sort of getting into the place where we're trying to predict really complicated species interaction, really complicated, fine scale manifestations of different locally adapted populations that are going to, respond in different local ways. So, yeah, I think that's a big question. And I think, frankly, we don't quite know how climate change is going to affect salmon in many different places. But I think that lack of knowledge is also really important. I think we need to sort of really embrace the parts of the unknown that we don't know.
I have a question for Michelle and Karen, and it's John Lamont asks, what species of salmon or what types of salmon are increasing in the Mackenzie River drainage? And I was also interested in the trends in your traditional fish that you consume, the Arctic chars. Are you seeing differences and changes in the trajectories of those populations as well?
I could talk about fishing here in the Mackenzie Delta, and also where we go in the summertime to our fishing camps. Myself being a fisherman, sometimes I get, I don't know, maybe 100 dolly varden and maybe 500 Arctic Cisco. That's what we work on during the summer, and I might get the odd salmon. But last year, not last year, but the year before, I only got like maybe 30 Arctic Cisco and 0 Arctic char. I might have got 1 salmon, but it's climate change. Climate change are changing everything. When I traveled to Shingle, there used to be a big island. It used to be called the Reefers Place or something. You can't even see it now when you cross the ocean. So things are really changing. And even when at the start we talked about Arctic salmon doing a cookbook, because we know salmon is going to be more in this area in the future. We got people from all over the Canadian Arctic, wherever the salmon was from, on Karen's little display before, that there's a cookbook out there. So I know for Aklavik, more and more people are eating salmon if they're catching it in their net, because it's it's there more often than it was in the past.
Yeah, and so the most common salmon that people catch that Michelle was referring to is chum salmon. And so that's also the species that is historic, and it's also the species that is increasing most of all of the species of Pacific salmon. Those spikes of salmon that you saw on the graph are really high spikes of mostly chum salmon, especially in the Mackenzie River system. Most recently, though, there's also been a couple of spikes of sockeye salmon, actually, in the last 4 or 5 years. Most of those salmon are actually being caught in the outer communities, though, not in the Mackenzie River system. So in the communities on the Arctic archipelago, Illasiak and Sax Harbor. And in fact, those years where they were catching sockeye salmon, they caught more sockeye than they did char. The other species that's increasing is pink salmon. Not in the higher numbers necessarily, but in more places. Pink salmon are just exploring all over the place and are popping up everywhere, and including into the Eastern Canadian Arctic. So this past year, 2021 in the fall, people are catching pink salmon on Baffin Island and Pangertung and Iqaluit and down in Nunatsiavut and Newfoundland and Labrador. So those are the species that are increasing most in the Canadian Arctic.
So just to follow up, are you seeing any Atlantic salmon up there?
Yeah, so in the Eastern Canadian Arctic, there's the occasional harvest of Atlantic salmon, mostly in the communities in Baffin Island, the ones that face Greenland across Baffin Strait. So there is a historic harvest of Atlantic salmon in those communities. So the harvest of an Atlantic salmon there isn't necessarily new or concerning or unusual. People don't talk about it as often. So we're working with communities to better understand what level of historic harvest there is and if that's changing with respect to Atlantic salmon. They are appearing in places where they may not have appeared before, including in Kingite, for instance, and in Hudson Strait. We were going to have workshops in some communities in Baffin Island, and then COVID hit, so those have been postponed. So that's a work in progress to better understand the Atlantic salmon changes in the Eastern Canadian Arctic.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Michelle. And this might be a good opportunity to put a plug in too. I follow along with the fish that you catch in the Facebook called Arctic Salmon. So I encourage folks to have a look at that and see some of the communities and the monitoring that they're doing there. So really great work. I've been following that ever since I saw you talk, Karen, and the Oregon AFS, I think or the Pink and Chum Symposium before COVID. So I've been following along for a while.
Yeah, it's also a good tool. I have to put a plug in for Facebook in the North. It's a good communication tool. It's widely used across the North, right, Michelle? Facebook. Yeah, that's how we get a lot of information out to people about salmon.
So again, this next question, I think it can go out to all of the panelists. So maybe we'll start with Jonathan and then move on to the others. But this one, really interesting questions from Brittany Janowan. Sorry if I butchered your name, but she's wondering how does salmon, what are your thoughts on how salmon populate these new habitats, given they're supposed to return to their natal streams? And, examples of 2019, you saw mass die-offs in one system and explosion into the Arctic in others. So isn't it extreme form of straying? Or if so, are certain species or populations more likely to find and populate new habitats? So Jonathan first.
Yeah, and I think this aligns well with a previous question about sort of what's being seen in the Arctic as well. And so I think the thinking is that it is indeed, a form of straying. And I think it, if we just again go back a little bit to sort of glacial history and the evolution of salmon, I think the idea is that salmon evolved to not all home in order to have, some eggs that aren't in that basket. And so presumably with glaciers, some systems are getting destroyed by glacial outburst floods or, appearing as brand new habitat. And so it was really, high fitness if you found those places. And so I think the idea is that, some portion of the population does stray. And I think, based on my reading of literature, it varies a lot based on different factors, but like 1 to 10% stray, depending on the species. And I think aligning with what Karen and team are finding in the Arctic, the higher stray rates are often seen in pink salmon, in chum salmon, and coho salmon, the species that have a little bit less fine scale local adaptation. And so those might be the species that we sort of see in the glacial streams first, as well as river type sockeye. It seems like river type sockeye also aren't quite as locally adapted as lake type sockeye, and those might be ones that are sort of finding some of these newer rivers first. But it's amazing to think about how presumably this is something that salmon, it's a form of their resilience. It's part of their sort of life history that they evolved in these dynamic landscapes, and we're seeing it play out now. A great question.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if there was no straying in salmon, we wouldn't get very many in the Arctic. So they're straying. There's 2 steps though. They have to show up and then they have to spawn successfully. So just because they're in the Arctic and in rivers in the Arctic doesn't necessarily mean they're established just yet. And that's the concern that you heard from Jody with all of the salmon that appeared in 2019, especially in Polytech and places that didn't catch salmon in the past. And they were in the rivers and in the places where char are spawning. And so the question is, could they spawn successfully in those places? And that's why we look at the habitats where the char are spawning to see if, first of all, if there's even viable temperatures for salmon to spawn and have their eggs incubate in. So we're seeing the adaptation or the evolution of salmon in real time, really, in the Arctic as more and more are showing up. And now with the catch of that juvenile, it's possible for them to spawn successfully and survive over winter. So now we have to key into where those places might be in order to better understand what conditions they need. We're also using some genetic techniques and working with Alaska Department of Fish and Game to better understand that piece of the question is where the salmon are coming from. Is it true that they could just be the ones that are missing in the south and just popping up into the north? It's a good question. And so we're working with Alaska Department of Fish and Game to try and understand where these salmon are coming from. And we're focused on chum salmon and also pink salmon for that question. Michelle, do you have anything to add?
I'll add that, yeah, we do see a lot of salmon. Like me working here at HTC at the time, there was only maybe 20 salmon, maybe 30 salmon. One year we got over almost 200 salmon, and that was crazy. That was a crazy time in our office. So 200 salmon just from little old Illasiak, because myself, the Hunters and Trappers Committee gears towards the Inuvialuit beneficiaries. They also have the Gwich'in Renewable Resource Council, where they focus on the Gwich'in beneficiaries in the community of Illasiak. So for us to get 200 salmon that one year was just amazing. But you could, out of those 200 salmon, I bet harvesters were keeping some salmon because, as I said, people are starting to eat it. So it's becoming more regular. So, and the questions Karen was answering, those are some of the questions that the members have, like, will it take over those fish holes? Is the water at the fish holes warming where they could spawn? And as Jody mentioned before, that char is like 50% of their diet. So if they don't have certain things in their diet, they have to compensate other ways. So it's good that, our voices are being heard and more research is being done along the way. Thank you.
And I have a follow-up for you, Karen. Urs Thomas asks, with the DNA, do you know where these fish are coming from? The chum and sockeye and pinks. Have you gotten any results yet?
Any results? You want the answers? So do I. We've done a little bit of work on the chum salmon specifically, where we do have some results, and there is population from the Mackenzie, at least one that is historic and is showing up in the as that in the genetic analyses. We think that it came from the Yukon River when the glaciers receded, which you heard about in John's talk at the very beginning. We think that was a potential pathway for chum salmon to colonize the Mackenzie River back 10,000 years ago. But there's also genetic evidence of chum salmon coming in from elsewhere, and that elsewhere seems to be northern Russian populations and also Western Alaskan populations. We haven't finished the analysis yet on the sockeye or the pink, but working on it. Well, I'm not working on it. Alaska Bourbon Fishing Game is working on it.
Yeah, very cool.
It seems there's lots of questions about DNA, and one species you haven't addressed yet are the sockeye. So you mentioned that they had increased in abundance lately. So are those also being analyzed? And are the recent records of sockeye salmon harvests in the high Arctic from freshwater systems, or are they in marine environment, or are they both?
So the harvests of sockeye have occurred mostly in Sax Harbor and Illasiak, and in both places they harvest the char in both the marine environment and in freshwater lakes. And so the sockeye are being harvested in both freshwater and in marine environments. In both Illasiak and Sax Harbor, a lot of the fishing actually occurs in lakes though, and that's where the char are. So with sockeye entering those systems and those systems being lakes and the sockeye are being harvested in the lakes, there's lots of questions about potential overlap in those locations as well. We haven't done the analysis yet on sockeye to better understand where they may be coming from, but that's definitely one of the main questions. And then also to see if they're river type or lake type sockeye that are appearing in those locations. There's the occasional sockeye that's harvested up the Mackenzie River. I would say there's about 30 in the database, for instance. Some years there's more than others. So it's not totally unusual to get a sockeye in somebody's net in the Mackenzie River system, but the more recent abundances, the unusual occurrences have been in the outer communities. And it's important for people to understand that nobody is actually fishing for salmon that I know of. Maybe Michelle can correct me, but they're catching salmon when they're fishing for other species in these communities.
Yeah, I guess I could touch on that. We're not fishing for salmon. We're fishing for, say here in the Mackenzie Delta, we're fishing for whitefish or coney. And then when we go to Shingle or to the ocean side, we're fishing for Arctic cisco, which we call herring, and for dolly varden char. So when we do get salmon in the net, it's a big thing. Like it's a big thing in the community. Like me, I have a bet going on here at the office. I wonder who's going to be first. So if this person comes in, we're all excited, but our community is so small, we know who's fishing where. And then for Shingle Point, every year when we do catch salmon, it's more and more fishermen are bringing in the salmon. So we're really not fishing for salmon. Yeah.
So excited that your presentations are generating all these interesting questions. So it's really nice. So this is a really interesting question from John Field, and I guess I'll open up to both panelists because I don't know the answer. Does DFO have a statutory obligation to manage Arctic salmon as a sustainable fishery going forward, or is this regarded as an invasive?
Well, I think the part about the invasive depends on who you ask. If Jody were still here, he calls them invasive all the time. It's less commonly referred to as invasive by people in Aklavik because there's a longer history, I think. So how people refer to salmon it depends on perspective, and that's what we tried to get across in our talk. the management of salmon is something that is an ongoing discussion. And Michelle, are you comfortable talking about co-management and how co-management works in
Sure.
Arctic?
So living here in Aklavik, we're a unique area, like some of the places Karen mentioned before is like Aklavik, Illasiak, Paulatuk. We're part of the Inuvialuit land claim, so we're within the ISR, and there's 6 communities in there. And within those 6 communities, we have like co-management boards under the Inuvialuit Game Council. And that's who kind of, through the HTC, that's who I kind of report to. But we do have co-management boards such as Fisheries Joint Management Committee, Wildlife Management Advisory Council. So then we do collaborate closely with like Yukon government, DFO, people in Alaska. We just like to get more collaborators together. The more knowledge we could share about species or fish species or wildlife species, the more better those animals will be, or fish species will be co-managed for the future. So I'm just like, I always say I'm just one part of the puzzle, but there's the younger generation that them, like the kids in preschool or whatever, they're the ones we as older people fight, not, I shouldn't say fight, but speak up so those younger generation could know that these things they weren't here that long ago. And it's not like I'm killer, like elderly or old or whatever. I'm still a young puppy. But yeah, there's co-management is a big thing. Like we can't do it by ourselves. We all have to have co-management partners. And when you do that, then you have a good working relationship with others. You get more things done in a timely manner. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. So the information that we're gathering from harvesters and from the science feeds that co-management process about salmon. So the discussions and decisions will be made at that level.
And as a follow-up to that, we had a question specifically about otoliths. Are you collecting otoliths as part of the collections and therefore looking for potential hatchery marks for otolith tagged fish? Yes. I have a really interesting question here from Paul McCullen. He says, potentially on the flip side of concerns for char, Dolly Varden, is that char are aggressive feeders, and in South Central Alaska to Southeast Alaska, Dolly Varden and char are known as sea wolves and predate heavily on salmon fry. Just wondering if salmon could increase char numbers, given if they're reproducing and producing fry. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there could be some potential benefits of having salmon around, and that's one of them with the fry. And at least in Alaska, salmon fry and eggs are a food source for other fish in the river. Salmon and Dolly Varden co-occur in rivers in Alaska. And I used to work in Alaska, and I've seen them eat the salmon eggs myself. So it is a possible food source and potentially could help the char Dolly Varden in that way. There are also, you heard the concerns though from people with salmon moving in. So it's kind of a lots of questions and lots of research to be done. Michelle, do you have anything to add?
Like I mentioned before, I mean, people are seeing more salmon. So when we developed that cookbook, it was good to get me myself, because I'm allergic to fish, I don't eat it. But if I wasn't, I would be eating it probably, because I used to eat Dolly Varden, but I mean, even people long ago used to say they used to feed it to their dogs as dog feed, but they didn't realize that those salmon they were giving to their dogs were as salmon you could get in the restaurant down south. So more and more people are making that change to eating salmon because they know it's going to be within the system. And even not to get salmon here at work, like this last year and this summer 2022 and 2021 not to get much salmon in the office. It was, now we have the question of what are the salmon doing? What we want to know, where they went or what's happening out there in the ocean, because not get salmon here in the office is very unusual. So to hear more like about stories about high water, I mean, we see it as harvesters on the land, but to hear, I always stress here at work that we need to collect that traditional knowledge of what the harvesters are saying about salmon, because when we talk about salmon being in Aklavik for years, there's no data of that anywhere. It's just from talking to the elders. So I always stress that somewhere along the way, we need to collect that traditional knowledge so it could be for the future generation. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And I just posted that paper on the Facebook site last night. Evaluate knowledge of range expansion just came out.
And one last question. We're almost out of time for Jonathan. You talked about salmon invading these new habitats. Are you seeing char, other species in there as well? And especially given these, potentially predatory on frog.
Yeah, work by Sandy Milner, I believe, did find, I think char were some of the first species to show up actually. They can do pretty well when it's pretty darn cold, and so they were there. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to think about how those interactions will play out, whether we have both species in those habitats. And back in the day, I studied some of those food web interactions, and I think there's a lot of people thinking that, oh, salmon are really helpful for char, but I think the competition is a concern too, especially in terms of the food use. But in the glacial systems, yeah, char show up pretty rapidly actually.
Well, it is almost 3:30, so we have officially ran out of time. I'd just like to thank again the speakers, all the really wonderful questions. This has been really fun, really enlightening and super interesting. So thank you very much for coming. And
extend our appreciation to Jody as well, and what a fascinating perspective. There's still a few more questions that are unanswered, so we will catalog those questions. We'll get them to the speakers, and we'll attempt to provide answers to folks who haven't got an answer to their question yet. But really, thank you all for your participation and for the thoughtful presentations, and stay tuned for our next seminar, which is May 25th. Is that right? On Indigenous knowledge.